Ready for a deep dive today? We're going to be exploring something really interesting, I think, the intersection of Buddhism and psychology.
Hmm.
And, it's way more than just those mindfulness apps or,
Yeah.
trying to find your Zen.
Right. Yeah. Definitely going beyond the surface level on this one. Really trying to explore how these two disciplines, which are often seen as these separate worlds, can actually share a common goal to understand the human mind and then also to alleviate suffering.
We've got this paper, really compelling paper, from the American Journal of Interdisciplinary Innovations and Research. It's called A Comprehensive Review on the Correlation Between Buddhism and Psychology. It's by Huong Xuan Vu. And yeah, it seems like there's more to this connection than you might initially think.
Absolutely. And one of the things that Vu does really well in this paper is show how these fields kind of approach the mind. So Buddhism has this long history of studying the mind from the inside out. So meditation, introspection, really getting to know your own thoughts and feelings almost on like a personal level. Psychology has traditionally leaned more on the outside in, so using experiments, observations data to study the mind.
So it's almost as if they're kind of coming at the same question from two totally different angles.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder what we could learn by bringing those two together.
Exactly. And you know what's so fascinating is we are starting to see this collaboration take shape. Think about mindfulness and how it's gone from this niche practice to something that's like widely discussed. And a lot of that is thanks to John Kabat-Zinn and his mindfulness-based stress reduction program, MBSR, from back in the 1970s.
MBSR, right? Yeah. Isn't that where we start to see this overlap of Buddhist practice and modern clinical settings?
Exactly. So MBSR basically takes those core principles of mindfulness meditation and adapts them for a secular context. No robes, no chanting required. It's about, learning to pay attention to your breath, your body, your thoughts, and doing it all without judgment. And the research on this is actually really compelling.
It is. It's been shown. I mean, they've used it for everything from chronic pain to anxiety.
Yeah.
And what I think is really interesting, though, is it's not just some like feel-good technique. It's actually measurable results in clinical settings. That says a lot.
It does. It really highlights how when you actually take these Buddhist practices, you put them to the test in scientific studies, they're effective tools for improving well-being.
So as we kind of like dig deeper into this paper, I'm curious to see how else does this intersection play out? Because clearly Buddhism has more to offer than just mindfulness.
Yeah, you're right. It's not just about seeking this calm and peaceful state of mind. Buddhism actually provides this really unique framework for understanding and addressing difficult emotions. Anger, fear, jealousy, all those emotions that are often kind of at the root of our suffering. And these insights are very relevant to the work being done in therapy today.
That's a good point. So we're not just talking about, meditation cushions and finding your Zen. Buddhism has actual tools for dealing with like the messier parts of being human.
Yeah.
What are some examples of that?
Well, take the Four Noble Truths, for example. So this is one of those foundational teachings in Buddhism. And it's interesting because it offers this framework that actually mirrors the therapeutic process in a lot of ways.
The Four Noble Truths. Okay, so
Yeah.
it's kind of like, everybody's heard of them, but how do they actually connect to something like therapy?
Well, it's the framework. So the first truth that's, acknowledging that suffering is real, right? We all experience it, just maybe in different ways. And that's something that therapy acknowledges, right? People come because they're struggling. Then the second truth pushes us a little further. It says, okay, understand the cause of that suffering. Like, dig a bit deeper. And in therapy, that often translates to, what are the thought patterns, the past experiences, even just behaviors that might be contributing to what you're going through right now.
So instead of just being stuck with these problems,
Yeah.
Buddhism and therapy both say like, hey, let's figure out where this is coming from.
Exactly. And then the third noble truth, that's where we get a little bit of hope, right? It says that suffering can be overcome. And it's not to say that challenges magically disappear, but it's more like our relationship to those challenges, that's what can change. And that's where those practical tools of Buddhism and a lot of therapeutic approaches, that's where they come in.
Okay, so let's talk about these tools. We've talked about mindfulness. What else does Buddhism sort of offer for dealing with these, difficult emotions?
So the paper talks about things like cognitive reframing, which is basically just challenging and changing those unhelpful thought patterns. And that's something that's really big in cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, where you're really focusing on like, okay, what are those distorted thoughts and how can we reframe them so they're not contributing to those negative emotions?
It's like Buddhism saying, hey, we don't have to let every negative thought that we have just like completely control us. Like we can actually examine it and choose something different.
Exactly. And this all ties into that fourth noble truth, the path to the cessation of suffering. You've probably heard of this, the eightfold path. And it includes things like right mindfulness, right effort, right concentration. These are all active practices, for cultivating a healthy relationship with our thoughts, our emotions.
It's amazing to me how these ancient practices are so relevant to how we approach, well-being and mental health today.
Mhm.
And it's not about like becoming a Buddhist. It's just about like taking these insights and applying them.
Yes. And this is where we get to a point that's really interesting, where Buddhist thought really diverges from like traditional Western psychology.
Yeah.
The idea of anatta, which is often translated as non-self. And again, this isn't about denying that you exist as an individual, but it's challenging that idea that there's this fixed, independent self.
Okay, now this is where I think a lot of people, myself included, are going to need some explanation. How does the idea of like non-self actually apply to our lives? It seems pretty radical.
It can feel radical, right? Especially coming from this Western perspective where it's all about, individuality and self-esteem. But think about it this way. What if that sense of self that we have, what if it's not as solid and unchanging as we think it is?
So instead of being this fixed entity, it's like we're more fluid and interconnected.
Mhm.
I can see how that challenges a lot of assumptions about who we think we are.
Yes. And this idea of non-self has actually had a pretty big influence on some of the newer approaches in therapy,
Only like what?
like mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, or MBCT. We touched on this earlier. It draws a lot from this concept. So instead of trying to eliminate those difficult thoughts and feelings, those difficult emotions, MBCT says just observe them. Don't judge. Just notice that they're there and that they're temporary. They don't define you.
So instead of getting caught in that spiral of I'm not good enough or I'm a failure, it's more like, okay, I'm having that thought, but it doesn't have to like run the show.
Precisely. And one of the biggest things that they've found with MBCT is this shift in perspective, this letting go of that fixed self. It can be really powerful in preventing relapse for people who've dealt with depression.
Wow, so this idea of non-self from Buddhism, when you use it in therapy, it can actually help people break free from these like negative thought patterns that keep them, stuck. It's amazing to think that like just letting go of that idea that we have this fixed self can have such a big impact. It kind of makes you wonder like what else could be possible if we started to question some of these assumptions?
Right. Like it really challenges us to think differently about our thoughts, our emotions, and like you said, even our own identity. And the paper mainly looks at the clinical applications, but I think this goes way beyond just therapy.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. Think about like personal growth, relationships, even just dealing with everyday life. If we're not so stuck on this idea of a fixed self, how does that change things?
It's a really interesting question. Does it help us to be more adaptable or more forgiving of ourselves and other people? Does it change how we view, I don't know, living a meaningful life? It's definitely something to think about.
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening. It's amazing to me how these ancient Buddhist teachings, they're not just relevant, they're actually like really insightful for how we live today.
Yeah, and it speaks to the wisdom in these traditions, right? And I think, this paper shows that we're really just starting to understand what's possible when we bring Buddhism and psychology together.
It seems like there's so much more to discover. And on that note, I think we've given everyone a lot to think about today. So
Yeah.
until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those questions.